Yo, my name's Emil, otherwise known as Kentro. I've been meaning to do this for a little while. Just want to give you like an overview of how I mix down a track and where that comes from. I think there's a big misconception that the mix down is something to be left for the end. Actually, pretty much everything you do when you're creating a track builds into that mixdown. So in this video, I'm just going to give you a run through a track which I've recently finished. It's called Mercurio. I've just put it up on my SoundCloud for free download. So I'll give you a bit of a play of it now, so you can hear kind of what we're working with. It's not the most amazing mixdown in the world, but I think it's pretty clean, and it should serve its purpose in kind of demonstrating a few good tips and kind of methodologies as to how you might want to mix down tracks. So I'll give you a bit of a play of that now.
Hello, my name is Dr. Mercurio Arborea. It has long been my dream to find the perfect way for people to achieve simply happiness. Seem to be things that strangely elude us all, but it doesn't have to be that way. A dedicated team of herbalists, naturopaths, and healers have found a way to make that dream a reality. Sensory therapy and energy sculpting can guide you gently along the path to a new, better, happier you.
Right, so yeah, I think you get the idea of that anyway. So yeah, really, like what I want to talk about is basically just what makes a good mixdown and all the different elements that you need to combine to get to that point. So the mixdown starts really with your sound design in the very first instance, and even before that. One thing that I found to be incredibly useful in getting things sounding tight and workable quite quickly is having a good project template. Now you'll notice in this project, I've sort of color coded things, not too rigorously, but pretty on the ball. So all of this stuff, all the red stuff, that's all drums. All of that's drums. Purple is all effects. Green is all bass. The dark green is for subs, some of which you can see isn't being used there. That can go, actually. And then for like synthy melodic sections and stuff, they're all blue. Now, all of these things correlate to bus channels as well, which I have set up. So if I scroll over here on my mixer, you will see buses for all of these different things. So aside from this bunch of effects channels here, we have a bass bus, which will be all the main bass sounds. That's just pure bass sound. Sub obviously just sub. And then I've got a separate one for the kick and the snare. There's nothing on that. Basically, yeah, these are mainly used just so I can route sidechains around easily. If I've got a couple of different layers for my kick, I can send them both here, and then both of them can go and trigger a sidechain somewhere else. Same deal for the snare. I've got kick and snare bus there, so I guess I wanted to sidechain some things with both quite easily. Percussion, nothing on it. It's just a nice way to sort of group all of my kind of percussive sounds in the drums. All of those things you'll see. So kick and snare buses are routed to the kick and snare bus, which has gone to the drums bus. Percussion bus has gone to the drums bus, and the drums bus goes out to main. Now, this project template, I'm going to open up just a new song so I can show you kind of what it is. It's my Vobes template for when I'm feeling really Voby, because that's always a good way to start a tune, really. So when that decides to load, right? So this is the empty template, and as you can see, I've got a lot of stuff set up here already. So I've got my kick, snare, hat, and cymbal channels, which I can easily duplicate and route them to the correct places. Bass, that should actually, that should be going there. Effects goes to the effects bus. All of these goes to the bass bus. There's a mix of audio channels and MIDI channels here, so depending on where I'm starting in a track, sometimes I might want to just drag some bass samples on here that I made earlier. Something I've resampled, or sometimes I might just want to start from scratch, or I've got a sound in mind that's going to work for this idea. So the idea of the template is basically just to sort of like cater for all possibilities. But in terms of how it affects a mixdown, what it means is, so if I go to my bass bus, this is probably the best example. So I've got an ozone imager here, and all that's doing is just making sure that everything that gets sent through to my bass bus is mono. Below 140 hertz, all of that's mono. That saves any possibilities for, just weird width in the low end that can cause phasing problems, anything like that. Really, low end, just always keep it mono. And also, yes, it's stereo going into here, and then I'm forcing it mono, so it's potential that there is potential there for phasing issues, but they will become really apparent when they're run into this and forced to be mono. So at that point, I can go back up the chain and see what's causing the problem. So that's really important to have that on the bass bus. Aside from that, I've got two compressors. Now, these are just sidechain compressors, and they're really aggressive, actually. And I've got all these splitters set up. I mean, this is maybe a bit overkill. You could do the same thing using like a Pro MB, for example. I'm pretty sure this takes multiple sidechains, so you could say I want to sidechain that band and I want to sidechain that band, and that would be quite easy. I might even do that. But in this case, I'm doing it like this. It also means that I can sort of drop in effects and more processing between them, kind of for each band. So it is a bit more flexible, although long-winded. But what these splitters are actually doing is they are frequency splitting. So this is basically frequency splitting for what I would see as the fundamental of my snare. Usually it's going to be a touch above 200. For a lot of tracks, I'll notch this down, maybe give it a bit of extra breathing room as well. If the fundamental of the snare's poking up at about 200, maybe around 178, 180, something like that, is a good place to have that to count for sort of roll off and everything. This splitter splits at 300. So basically what we've got here now, everything between 180 and 300 goes through this compressor, and the snare is sent to that compressor. So that means that just the fundamental of the snare is going to be poking through all of my bass sounds, but without being too aggressive about it, without being kind of, just a kind of catch-all, let's just do the whole band, because that's not logical, and it's kind of better to keep it detailed. This way you will manage to, I'll show you the top one as well. So this one splits again. So everything above 3.74K goes through this compressor, which is also sidechained to the snare. And that's because on a snare, you generally have the two most important parts, in my opinion. And it's, it depends on the type of snare you're making and all of that stuff. But for this kind of upfront Neurofunk kind of drum and bass, the two most important parts are your punchy fundamental at the bottom, 200 hertz ish, and then that bit of fizz that you have at the top, that sort of, 5 to 10k, that kind of hi-hat area that's on the top of the snare, and those two elements are what really causes a snare to really punch through a mix. So if you can get them cutting through everything else, then you're golden. So I'll just dive a bit into the settings here. Now the attack is on 0, so as soon as that transient hits, I want everything to duck in this frequency range that this compressor's on. The ratio is pretty high, the threshold's pretty low. Sometimes I will even push them more and make them far more aggressive, because the other thing is that the release is so short, it's 52 milliseconds. Now that release is basically timed to just let the transient through. This is for short, punchy, sharp transients. They'll get through the mix. So you hear that there's a fucking snare there because you'll hear the snap, but the rest of it, the kind of the little tail of the snare and stuff, that will just sort of bleed straight back into the mix. The reason for this is if I leave this open too wide, then you're going to noticeably hear the bass ducking out, whereas if I don't and keep it really tight, you'll hear the transient, which is really the most important part. And as long as it's a good mix, the tail of the snare won't be inaudible. It will just be quieter compared to everything else. But yeah, so I find this kind of multi-band sidechaining is actually a tip I initially got off Pythias. Thank you for that. I basically messaged him and asked him how the fuck he was managing to fit all his arpeggios, because I do have a sort of love for arpeggios in these busy mixes, and he said one thing: multi-band, sidechain, everything, and it really works. It really, really works. So I've got another compressor here on the sub, another imager, which you don't really need on the sub. It's just there for good measure, just to make sure. But generally, in the actual sub channel, I'll make sure that that's mono. So yeah, this one's for the kick, just to poke through the sub. Sometimes it's not necessary, depending on the frequency that your sub's sitting at and the frequency your kick's sitting at. Sometimes the kick will be up at 100 hertz and the sub will be way down at 42 or something. And in that case, it's maybe not so necessary, but it's good to have as a rule of thumb. Generally, you will always need to sidechain it, even if just a little bit, because all of that low-end headroom, when you have something that's, let's say the kick's at 70 and your sub's at 42. Now, those are quite separate, but not that separate. There are still going to be areas where they kind of cross over, because we're not doing 96 dB cuts on the edge of each of those frequency ranges. They're going to roll into each other a bit. And what that does is eats up headroom, which means that you can't make your mix as loud in the end, or as clear, actually, in the end, as you would be if those things were kind of taking turns a little bit. So that's what the sidechain's there for. So aside from that, what else have I got here? Not much. Just a load of setup buses ready to go with everything wired into them. So I can just start, when I start a new project, I can start dragging and dropping things in here, and it all just sort of works. The sidechains are set up. Like, there's I think there's just a limiter on there, stock setting, just doing nothing, just kind of because you're not supposed to, but mix into a limiter. It's nice to mix into a limiter. Take it off every now and then. Make sure you're not completely fucking it up, but generally, do that. And yeah, that's about it really. The send channels are quite useful. Again, really, really basic. I've got a long reverb and a short reverb. I've got a little distortion send with a couple of, this could be anything. I'd change them out as and when, really. A delay one. Saves a bit of system resources sending these around the place, and also you get a bit more of a consistent sound, which again will help your mix down, because all of your effects are going through a handful of channels rather than having loads of different instances of effects on all the other channels, which all need managing independently and can potentially get muddy and stuff. This way, they're all kind of segmented. If something's got reverb on it, you know where it's going to be, and you can kind of come in and tweak these settings. I have these on splitters as well, so that's disabled, and everything above 438 is going through the reverb. And it's just stuff like that. Massive time saver, and also just gets you a familiar workflow that actually starts making things sound really clear and good very, very quickly if you know what you're doing. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the track template. But yeah, I mean, you know, it's a massive kind of it's a massive aspect of getting a good mix, in my opinion. So aside from this, I mean, let's talk about drums, I guess, for a bit. So if I solo the drum bus. Right. So another big part of getting a nice clean mix is making sure that there's no unnecessary signal or information in frequency ranges that you don't want it to be in, or that it doesn't need to be in, especially if those ranges are being used by other things. So I think you'll find, for example, I bet if I pick any of these hi-hats that I'm using, I use a lot of samples from kind of like acoustic drum packs. Well, I'm not sure that one is, but anyway. Right, so that's disabled for some reason. That's weird. Right. So if I disable that, you can hear the low end information in that, and actually, you really don't need that. If I let's just turn that off and turn this back on so we can see all of this. I mean, look, that's sub frequency, all this up through the mids. It's a hi-hat. We don't really need any of that, especially because this is, you know, there's a lot going on in this beat. It's drum and bass. It's very quick. So actually, you do kind of want to minimize the number of things that are happening at once. So just by doing that, just low cut the shit out of things like hi-hats, cymbals, rides. I do it on all of them, absolutely all of them. And what that means is that you have room for your... Oh, fuck, I haven't done that, haven't I? Let's get rid of that. Right. You actually have room for your snare, you have room for your kick, and more importantly, you have room for all the other channels that you're going to have on your track. So, you know, especially one like this, where there's quite a lot going on. There's a couple of different, like, kind of big beefy bass sounds, and then there's all these sort of little synths and incidental bits, and, you know, arpeggios and stuff, and you know, that all adds clutter. So making sure that these things sit separately, not just by frequency range, but also by timbre as well. Just separating them out in the mix makes a big difference. And EQing is obviously a massive part of that. Filtering, stuff like that. Just giving everything a clear cut section in the mix. Aside from that, so I mean, yeah, that's the drums. And yeah, you know, you want big punchy sounding drums as well. So I mean, this snare's muted. I guess we don't need that. But right, this is a snare I made a while ago just by layering up. I got an acoustic drum sample pack. It's free. I think it's called NSA Custom Drums. I highly recommend it. I use it on every single track, either for doing things like this, where I pick a load of sounds out of it and beef them all up and make something that's gonna work like that for big drum and bass tunes, but also just for things like rides, nice acoustic, clean cymbals and hats and stuff like that. It's great. Yeah, NSA Custom Drum Set, I think it's called. But yeah, I mean, all this snare is, for example, you can see it's really simple, the processing chain on that, and it doesn't sound that much different, but Camel Fat is an absolute beast. Use it on everything, everywhere, every channel. There's no excuse not to. It makes everything sound better. My go-to, like, literally, I'll drop a snare on any track and I'll just get a bit of mech and a bit of tube and a bit of exciter, sometimes a bit of compression, and it just, you know, the mech and the tube kind of fill out the kind of lower harmonics quite nicely, and the mids, and give it a little bit of extra oomph, and then the exciter just like brings out that bit of sparkle, and yeah, just between them, plus the fact that you can just redline this thing to fuck and it just doesn't care. It just makes everything sound louder and better. Then yeah, I mean, I almost use it as a limiter a lot of the time, just because you can ram stuff right into it really hot, and it will still come out sounding good. What else have we got on here? So little EQ, right? So I'm ducking just below the fundamental, just because if I take that off, you can see there's all this, all that low end information. We don't need that there. We want the mix clean. We will only use the parts of the frequency range that we need for each given sound. And what else? And a limiter, just to trim the peaks off, just to get that little bit of extra loudness and punch out of it. And to be honest, those three things, I mean, that accounts for like 90% of the stuff that I do when I'm putting together a track. The same goes for bass. Where's that nice bass sound? Yeah, so there's this thing. I do like that one. I mean, this one's, there's a bit more going on here, but yeah, obviously first port of call, Camel Fat, Pro Q, limiter. That's just to get kind of an initial set of control. Camel Fat, although it's a distortion unit, is quite good for controlling sounds. If you use it quite subtly and don't just, rag it to fuck, it's actually quite good for controlling the dynamics a little bit at the same time as giving it a bit of saturation, a bit of compression, and a bit of distortion, just like a little bit of everything and rounding something out quite nicely. Limiter to cut off the edges. Pro Q, again, I'm sure I'm just rolling something off there. There you go. Giving it a bit of extra top end for that fizz, but boosting's bad. Don't do it, except for when you really want to. And pulling out the 300 hertz range. The mud range, as I was taught in music technology school before they kicked me out. The mud range, anywhere from about, I guess like 100 to 400 hertz. It just sounds fucking horrible. You've got to be really careful with it. Pulling that out generally will, on big sounds that have like a really wide spectrum. So when you've got, a snare hits right in the middle of that sort of the fundamental at 200, but that's okay because it's just doing that one thing. When you've got a big sound like this, which basically occupies the whole fucking spectrum, and it's the meat of your tune, a very easy way for it to sound muddy. I mean, if I just turn that off, it just doesn't sound. That little bit of extra control, that little bit of extra tightness that you get from ducking that out, that contributes as well. Stuff like this, all these kind of synthy things that I've got going on down here. So I don't know what this is. That thing. What's this? My floaty little harp. Yeah, all of these things, they're all low cut. They're all kind of, they've all had their place in the mix. Never so much so that the sound doesn't lose its kind of meat or its presence. To be honest, I think there's a lot to be said for selecting the correct sound in the first place. If this sound, for example, was an octave lower, it simply would not fit in the mix at all, because it would be, I assume, somewhere maybe at the same octave as the main bass, and they would be fighting for space. So choosing the right sounds, but then also just making sure that you're high passing them and low passing them and everything in the right places, and EQing out the unnecessary areas. That's pretty much it. Just sound selection, careful EQing, cutting where you need to, and yeah, compression and limiting, I guess, is something I can talk a little bit more about. So I mean, let's have a look at. Generally, for the individual channels here, before they go to my buses, it's rare that I will put a hard limiter on something. I may do it kind of in the middle of an effects chain just to trim off some peaks so that they're not going to throw off the subsequent plugins and cause them to kind of artifact or kind of give too much of effect to that one peak, which I don't really want. I can put a limiter halfway through and it will just sort of tame it all out and let me continue kind of sculpting whatever sound that is. But in general, where I'll actually be using limiters in a sort of mixed down capacity will be all in these buses here. So the drums bus is a good example. I've got 2 limiters and a compressor here. So let's solo that. Let's solo that and have a look what they're doing. So my compressor here, it's quite a low threshold, and that is actually because a lot of the percussion is much quieter than the main kick and snare. Not too much of a ratio. Ratio's on about 2.2, 2.3. The attack, again, this is sort of like the compressors that I was using for sidechains before, except the other way round now. So the release on those was 50-something milliseconds. The attack on this is like 44, around that same area, because what we want to do with this is we want to let the transient through, and then we want to compress everything else and bring it up a little bit. Well, technically you're making it quieter, but we've got makeup gain, so yeah. So the idea is let the punchy bits through, then just bring everything else up a bit, fill it all out, bit of glue, and then parallel. So I've brought up the dry gain a bit as well, just to mix the compressed signal with the original dry one, because that sounds sick on drums, basically. Or just do that. Aside from that, then I've got a limiter here. Again, slow attack, sort of slow release, no look ahead. This punchy style is quite nice, and just linking the transients and everything. I've got a little bit of a boost on there just to beef them up a bit. And you'll see that all that's doing is just dealing with these transients, but it's still letting the first part through. So we're still getting that snap. It's just bringing everything else up a bit. And then to deal with those spiky transients that we've been letting through this whole time, I now am going to clip it using this clipping preset. And another little boost. Sometimes it doesn't even need a boost there. But yeah, basically just all that's doing is just there. All that's doing is just, it's getting us a couple of extra dB out of it, without doing any real damage. It's just trimming off those transients a bit, but we've given them so much room to poke through here compared to the rest of the signal, that they're still faring quite well. This is the only point in the chain where they're actually being affected. And that is also very similar to my master channel. Well, we'll probably talk about that in a bit. Let me see what else I've got going on here. So yeah, a bit of compression, bit of limiting on the synth stuff. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's pretty much it. Yeah, I mean, all these effects, these are the ones where you sort of lose a bit of control, because your signal, generally, I don't use these effects with the buses. They'll all come from, like, these various channels that need them. But yeah, so they might be a bit spiky, but at least they are the only spiky things that are going into the master, because all of this is quite nicely kind of rounded and controlled. I guess we talk about gain staging a bit, actually, as well. Now, most modern DAWs use what's called a floating point audio engine, which is a really fucking clever thing, which means that you can clip everything as much as you like, as long as you don't clip the master. So all of these channels, if I wanted to, they could go into the red. It's advisable that you would try and keep them peaking around 6 dB, just so you have a bit more room to work in the master channel, although I think that is really sort of just a remnant of people working with analog desks. You don't really have that problem here, because computers are way cleverer than bits of old plastic with circuit boards in them. So yeah, basically, it's good practice, I guess. It's good practice to kind of get everything relatively level here. I'm actually going a bit hot here. A lot of these are on 0. I would usually bring them down maybe, 6 dB, minus 6 dB, something like that. Or maybe... Oh yeah. So there you go, yeah. So the signal is actually peaking. These kick and snare ones don't matter, because they're going into the drums bus. Still -2 or whatever, but yeah, So then we have the master channel. Now, people always freak out about master chains. I mean, mastering is a bit of a dark art, and also not. So, I mean, if I take all of these off, you should be able to make a very, very, very good mix without using anything on your master chain at all. So it doesn't sound that much different. We're peaking a little bit. There's a lot more dynamic range, and all of this stuff here. To be honest, I would actually pull this fader down, and let's do that now. So let's say that -6. Yeah. So if I wanted to send this to a mastering engineer before it got released or something like that, I would pull this down, take all of these off, make sure there's plenty of dynamic range in the master channel. Yeah, lots of room. For the mastering engineer to work with. However, a lot of the time you just want something that sounds fucking loud now, because you might want to go play it in a set. You might just want to know what it's going to sound like through a limiter, and then you can do a bit of, you know, this is my sort of kind of go-to little mastering chain. It varies per tune really, but these are kind of like, you know, some trusty tools. It's all the FabFilter stuff again. I like to keep it simple with plugins. That's another thing. Using too many fucking plugins, it kills your process. It kills creativity. It's much better to know a handful of plugins very, very well than it is to have thousands and thousands of them, that half of which you've never used before. Know your fucking tools, basically. But yeah. So this compressor, again, on the master, is doing a very similar thing to the one that I had on the drums bus. So yeah, we're letting all those transients through. 4 ratio, yeah, fine. Little bit of dry gain up as well, but not a huge amount. It's, yeah, rolled off the lows slightly too. It's basically just there as a little bit of mix glue. It's not trying to over compress anything or make it really fucking squash. It's just there to kind of tie everything together nicely. Bit of saturation. This is actually quite an interesting little thing. So all I've done is just pulled out Saturn on its default setting, warm tape. I haven't touched anything except for the mix, which I've brought down to about 50%. And all this does is the saturation kind of adds a few harmonics here and there, but it also smooths out some of the harsher ones that already existed. So some of the peaks that you might have poking through that are a little bit harsher, this will sort of tame them a little bit, and it will also bring some of the kind of undertones up a little bit, in quite a kind of like pleasant sounding way, which also in turn means that you can push your limiter a little bit harder because you've got rid of some of these extra peaks just by kind of smoothing it out a little bit with Saturn. So then into limiter again, attacks slow, we're letting the transients through still, punchy style, all of that shit, basically the same fucking thing that I was doing before, little bit of a boost, and then one more for clipping, and none of this is particularly technical or overboard. It's just there to make it sound louder, really. That's about it. So I'll give you a play with all of that stuff off and then on, and you can kind of hear the difference. So yeah, you know, it does a good job. I think we're doing about somewhere between 3 and 6, -3 and 6 dB RMS there, which is decent. You know, it will hold up. It will hold up in a club against other tunes that have been mastered, which is a great sort of temporary fix. So yeah, that'll pretty much do it. Aside from that, I don't know if there's anything else I've really got to say at the moment. Yeah, I'm going to do another video, hopefully, at some point soon, just with some kind of, like, more creative tips, sound designy stuff, things like that. But yeah, please let me know what you think of this video. Let me know if it helped, or if you have any questions, or if I've done anything horribly wrong and you can show me a better way of doing it. I like that. Yeah, peace. Until next time.